Great. Well, thanks for the intro and thanks everyone for being here. It's an honor to have Wouter here to give us this talk, which was presented at an academic conference recently and actually received a Distinguished Paper Award. So congrats for that. And it kind of goes to show how important and how fascinating this work is. Wouter is a faculty, a professor at CISPA, which is a great institute in Germany that does a lot of security, privacy, and kind of related kinds of research. So we're going to hear from Wouter, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A and discuss a few things around his work. So thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Petros, for the great introduction. Okay, so I think looking around the room, thinking about the people at this conference, I think a lot of us believe in the power of technology to do good things, to make life and society better. And at the same time, I think also all of us know that when we introduce technology, when we use technology, there might be risks. There might be some security risks, there might be privacy risks. And as a community, I think we're getting better and better at mitigating these risks. And in the case that we cannot mitigate these risks, typically, I think a lot of us would make this argument of, okay, but users have a choice. They can decide, am I going to put all my data on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or not? What I want to be talking about today is work that I have done in collaboration with the International Red Cross, what operates in a very different setting. They try to help people that have been affected by crisis, by war, by famine, other natural disasters, in which case receiving aid is essential for them, quite frankly, to stay alive. In which case, you don't have the choice to say, nah, I'm not going to use this technology, right? Because not using this technology means that you and your family will essentially go hungry, okay? And so that puts a pretty high bar, I would say, in terms of which technology we would design and try to deploy in these settings. And so in today's talk, I want to run you through what we did in this setting. So just so that we're all on the same page, the aid distribution that I will be talking about are sort of essential human needs. So you might think of food, you might think of blankets, you might think of hygiene items, you might think about maybe baby formula when there are infants at play. And the traditional way that this type of items are distributed is that people at some point will register, and then later on they will come and pick it up. And then comes this process of, okay, I have a long list of names here, and I will just try and find your name on this list, and then check it off that you have been there and hand over these items. And I think a good first question to ask when you think about potentially digitizing something is maybe the first question, should you even digitize this? Now, I think in this case, it is pretty clear that there is a lot to be gained from digitization, because quite frankly, doing this does not scale. This works for tens of people, this works for hundreds of people. Already when you get to thousands, this starts to bog down pretty rapidly, and at 10,000s, you can essentially forget that this will work. So what we did when working on this project is work in pretty close collaboration with the International Committee for the Red Cross, which I think is one of the biggest well-known humanitarian aid organizations that operates in some of these very difficult areas that I sketched at the beginning of this talk. And this was a pretty intense collaboration. We had pretty frequent meetings with people from the Data Protection Office to understand and to essentially also validate our thinking, to figure out, are these things that we're doing, that we're understanding, do they make sense, or did we miss things? And then to sort of double down on this, we did a bunch of sessions, I think 2 I put on my slide, but I think there actually were 3 of them, where we met with actual people that had been in the field or currently are in the field from the Economic Security Group of the ICRC that got their hands dirty, as it were, to actually do this aid distribution, to operate in these difficult circumstances. And what we try to take away from this is to understand What are the requirements for such a system? What are requirements for a potential digital system that would help with aid distribution? What kind of risks should we think about? And in which context should these systems function? And all of these are important, right? If you get your requirements or your needs wrong, in the end you design a beautiful system and maybe get a beautiful academic paper and maybe even win a Best Paper award. But at the end of the day, nothing will come from this because it will be completely useless and nobody will deploy it. The same thing also applies for context. Again, can do a beautiful design, but if you cannot roll it out because you assumed something would work that actually doesn't work in sub-Saharan Africa, again, you lose. And what I try to do in my work is to stick relatively closely to these real-world constraints in order to design systems that actually do make sense, that can be deployed. Now, so that we all stay on the same page, I want to run you through what is essentially the outcome of our interactions with the Red Cross, namely, what was our understanding after a bunch of these sessions about how these systems should function. And I will do this by guiding you through actually the traditional aid distribution workflow, and then we'll later see how to digitize this. So, first thing that came as a surprise, I think, to us, and would probably come as a surprise to you, is that registration was typically done on a household level. So registration did not happen me, Wouter, and maybe my partner separately or my kids separately. No, all of these were grouped together in a household that is also typically bigger than sort of a family unit that you might think of in the West. This might include parents, this might include children, this might include other dependents, so a bigger group of people. And then what is also more difficult in this setting is that then during this registration process, somehow the people at this registration station, typically think of this as Red Cross employees, try to determine, are you even eligible for this program that we're currently registering people? And again, in our sort of Western context, this is typically not so difficult. I mean, maybe it is, but at least we have documents and we have more paperwork and we can use this to build up a frame of evidence. None of these might exist in these situations where people might not even have documents. A lot of people might end up having the same name. It's very difficult to distinguish between people. And it's actually very difficult to build up a ground truth of what you're even working on. And so a lot of this, again, coming back to context, right? Context matters here, and the things that you would expect would work actually don't work. And so to sort of solve this particular problem, what organizations tend to do is work with what they call village elders that know the people in this area, that will be able to vouch for them of having certain, if you want to call it very abstractly, properties that would make them eligible for receiving aid. And then once you've gone through this, you can then figure out how much aid should these people receive. Typically, this depends on the number of people in the household, but also whether they're infants, how many women, and other special needs that you might have. And then finally, because this registration process is so tedious, typically this is a registration that you will reuse, where you do aid distribution, let's say every month or every quarter for a year or maybe several months in a row. And then finally, all of this data is stored in what I'll, at least for the traditional mechanism, just call a big registration list where we capture all this data. Now, next comes the second part, which is, okay, now somebody shows up to actually receive this aid package. And this somebody will be a member of the household, not necessarily the head of household. So this head of household is a concept that is a typical common concept in the humanitarian setting, but it doesn't need to be that person that shows up to receive aid. This can be their eldest son, or the husband, or the wife, or whoever that shows up. And then next, this proceeds as you would expect. There is an eligibility check, which essentially means, is this person on the list? Okay, then we're good. And then comes the other obvious check, namely, did this person already pick up their package for this round of distribution or not? And the way you would do this is kind of the obvious way, at least in the paper-based setting. You take your list, you scribble somewhere, and that then becomes part of the evidence of having distributed aid in this round. Now, the final step is not strictly speaking part of like your bread and butter aid distribution, right? You could do without, except that typically out of pressure from donors, for example, there is a requirement for being able to do audits, being able to check this process, being able to follow goods along this entire supply chain, and in particular also being able to check this last step where you have a warehouse of goods that you then distribute to people. And this then hopefully guarantees that these limited resources that humanitarian organizations have are well spent. And I want to sort of emphasize that this pressure is both internal as well as external. It is internal in the sense that organizations really do have very few resources, and the better they can make sure that they don't unnecessarily give too many resources to one household, the better they can spread this out and to more people they can actually, in the end, help. There is also pressure clearly from donors, and when I say donors, I don't mean you and me, I mean State Department, like big national actors that spend essentially billions on humanitarian aid. Okay, so there is a lot of pressure to do this. Now in this case, what would a proof of audit look like? You take your list with the signatures, and that essentially acts as your proof. Now I see maybe, let's see, somebody pays attention here, right? Somebody with a security background might think about like, okay, Wouter, if your threat model is potentially a distribution station that wants to hide a couple of tons of rice, this list with a bunch of signatures is not particularly hard to fake, right? So there would be also other reasons that you want to introduce a more technological solution that goes beyond using tech is a little bit more efficient. So what I want to do is I want to think through with you what a digital solution might look like that tries to resolve these bottlenecks. And if you have done any form of computer science, which I'm guessing most of you have, or even if you have not, right, your first solution that you might come up with might look like something like this beautiful drawing that I put here on this slide, where essentially you use a centralized database where you store all the records of people that have registered. When you do distribution, people will show up, you try to find them in the central database, and there you store a record of having distributed items. Makes sense, right? And then, okay, fine, maybe you somehow need to solve the problem of, okay, how do we even recognize this person? So maybe you throw some biometrics at it, and then you have a nice little system that will actually do exactly what you want, right? It sort of ticks functionality-wise, all of this works. Now, does it? So it turns out that context matters. In areas where these systems typically are deployed, assuming that you can just connect to a central database probably doesn't fly, because your internet connectivity or your networking availabilities might be much less than you want. You might not have identity documents to sort of piggyback off and to build your systems on top of. And then, in addition to all of this, you might be creating a lot of privacy risk by having this sensitive database with a lot of records about very vulnerable people. Now, all of this might sound theoretic, but some of this has been tried. So in Yemen, WFP, the World Food Program, essentially built a digital identity system based on biometrics, very similar to what I sketched on the previous slide. And even besides the potential for privacy harms, they experienced a lot of pushback from the Yemen government that essentially did not want humanitarian aid organizations to essentially be deploying what they perceived as a parallel identity system. And is that good or bad? I don't know. I think from a privacy point of view, I am very worried about having such systems in the first place. And quite frankly, even if you're not, these examples indicate that one needs to be very careful about what one builds and designs. Now, the other point is that humanitarian organizations themselves are very well aware of the fact that they are dealing with very, very vulnerable people that do not have a lot of choice. And therefore, for themselves, they put the bar very high in terms of not doing harm to the people that they assist. And clearly, all of these have been inspired by things in the past where potentially this didn't always go as well as one would have expected. So what we set ourselves as a goal is to figure out, could we somehow design a system that does not suffer from these issues? And in our design, we made a couple of key points, and then I'll sort of try and sketch these, and then I'll dive into the details a little bit more to make them more concrete. But first of all, instead of centralizing all of this data in a centralized database, we decided to actually decentralize these data and put them with the individual households, with the individual recipients themselves, in the form of tokens that could either be a smart card or potentially a smartphone. I'll be talking about both of these, but I'll actually be focusing on the smart card because it's a little bit easier to convey the key ideas to you. And then, in order to do this check of making sure, has this person been here before or not, we're actually going to be using sort of one-time use tags that will let us detect whether double dipping happens. Will let us detect whether a household has already been here in this round. And then finally, we'll be using a cryptographic trick called homomorphic commitments rather, that lets us do auditing, but auditing in a pretty strong and privacy-friendly manner. Now, if you don't know exactly what these things are, I hope that in the next couple of slides, I'll be able to convince you nevertheless how they are useful. So, process-wise, we're going to proceed as we did for the paper-based system. So we're going to start off with the registration process. And this registration process has, as before, this dance to figure out eligibility, which is hard, but okay. Traditional methods sort of work. Once that has been established, the registration station will take from their pile a smart card that they reserve for this purpose. We'll load on this smart card the entitlement that they have determined that this household is entitled to receive. And then the recipient will load on their own smart card a biometric sample. This lets us bind, in some sense, this smart card to the recipient, but without, crucially, having to create a central database of biometrics whatsoever. And then finally, the card internally will generate a key that is household specific. So this is crucially that this key is generated internally. And then what I didn't put on this slide, but obviously is also important, what if you have multiple people in the household that might want to receive aid? You repeat this process by essentially cloning these cards but putting in the appropriate sample. Okay, so if Petros also registers, we replace my sample with Petros' sample. But the household key and the entitlement obviously stay the same. Everybody good? Okay. Now, what happens during distribution? The first part of distribution should probably come as no surprise to anybody here. The user takes their smart card, submits the biometric sample to the smart card checks. If this matches up, we proceed. Now the card interacts with this with the distribution station. First thing the distribution station does is figure out, am I actually talking with one of these trusted smart cards? AKA, can I trust what the heck this card is saying to me? Right? Because essentially all of this system is built on this trusted computing base built inside of this smart card. Once we have established that, the distribution station will tell the card, okay, this is the round that we're operating in, and if the card knows, okay, we have not done anything in this round, the card will send back the entitlement, essentially making a claim. These are the goods that this household is eligible to receive, together with this thing that I'll be calling a double spending tag. So this double spending tag is computed based on the round as well as the household key. Now, if you don't know what is a PRF, so a PRF is a pseudo-random function, but if you don't know, think of this just as the hash of the household key together with the round. And why is this useful? This is useful because the distribution station can keep track of all the tags that it has seen, and then even if somebody else from the household with another card would show up in the same round, because these cards share the same key, they would produce the same tag and therefore would be caught by the distribution station. Now, also for privacy, this is pretty good because of this hashing trick, because of this PRF trick, essentially all these tags will be looking random all the time, at least between rounds, making it very difficult to track people. Okay. Now you might be wondering, okay, cool, this works, that was not so difficult, very good. What about auditing, right? Because for auditing, we didn't really gain anything. If we were not willing to trust the distribution station before, we're probably not willing to trust it now either. And if you think about the scheme that I so far showed to you, it's pretty easy to cheat, right? Like there's nothing really that the distribution station can produce that would be irrefutable evidence that people have shown up, except for a bunch of random numbers that are kind of easy to generate. So we solve this in two ways. We introduce digital signatures over parts of the card's output, which then will provide evidence later on to the auditor that this was indeed from a real card, as well as we hide some of the information about the specific entitlements by using commitments. So let's put that together. So this is the picture from the previous slide, or at least the relevant part of the previous slide. In addition, the card will send a commitment to the entitlement as well as the opening. Now we'll sort of see why these two things both need to be sent. This commitment essentially will lock this entitlement in place, but without revealing it. The card will then also send the tag, the commitment, and a signature on these things. And it is now this thing that we'll be using as evidence during the auditing process. So what happens during the auditing process? Sorry, apologies for that. Very quickly, in terms of math, in terms of crypto details, if you know these commitments are actually Pedersen commitments to the entitlement, which I don't necessarily need you to sort of dig down into all this math, but what I want you to realize is that because of this funny structure here, I can actually multiply two commitments. And what happens is something kind of funny. I get a commitment to, in the exponent, the sum of two entitlements. And I can be repeating that, and I can sort of multiply commitments that hide what is inside, and I get, as if by magic, a commitment to the sum of the internal things. And that is what we'll later be using during audit. Namely, what does the distribution station produces? It produces a row for each user that showed up, containing the double spending tag, the committed amount, as well as the signature that the card produced. It will then tally up the total amount and say, okay, this is the total amount, and this is how you can verify that these homomorphically added up commitments actually give you this total amount. So that is essentially what the auditor does. It checks that each row is correct, namely it has a correct signature, that it hasn't seen these double spending tags before, and that this total sum that is contained in these commitments actually matches. And so the long story short of all of this is that instead of having very detailed transaction level information, all that we're now revealing during this auditing process is today or this week, this was the total amount of goods that have been produced, and all of them came from different eligible households, which is a lot less information than what we started off in the formal centralized version of this system. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what about smartphones? What do you do with those? Well, we kind of solve this by throwing a little bit more crypto at it. Because smartphones obviously do not act as a trusted execution environment. The trusted computing base of smartphones is huge, and typically, as an external party, you can actually not verify this. So instead of trusting what the card says or trusting what the phone says, we now rely on, we rely on anonymous credentials to capture eligibility and the amount. We use domain-specific pseudonyms instead of this PRF to create these one-time use tokens, and we tie all of this together using zero knowledge proofs. Now, if this doesn't really make sense to you, that's fine. For the people that recognize most of these, I think it kind of is the natural extension of the trusted execution environment version of the scheme that I showed you. That kind of work. So now to sum up all of this, right, I hope I convinced you that in this system, we actually managed to solve the problem set out by these humanitarian organizations in a way that does a lot less harm by just collecting very, very little information about individual people. We can do this both with smart cards and smartphones. It depends a little bit on the setting. I think typically you would use smart cards, but for example, in a Ukrainian context, you might think about using smartphones just because people have them and it lets you get off the ground much faster. What I didn't talk about today, and I really don't want to be talking about today, is that we did a whole bunch of work into formalizing all of these, being very formal, let's say, about which properties we really want, and to make sure that the things that we have designed actually hold up to scrutiny. And then finally, we tested this out just to show that indeed this works in practice. Now, none of these things would have been possible without a bunch of awesome collaborators that I just want to very quickly call out. So we have Boya and Professor Carmelo Troncoso at EPFL. I put here 2 people from the ICRC on the slide that we have been working closely with, but obviously there were many more people involved in this process, and without them, this would not have worked. Now, just to wrap up, I want to sort of highlight 2 things that I think are sort of relevant in a sort of broader, more general context. One is, it is actually possible if you take the time and effort to solve a lot of problems in a privacy-friendly way, in a way that does a lot less harm than maybe the first thing that would come to mind when you're thinking about this type of systems. And then 2, I think I would encourage everybody to work with this type of organizations, to think about working with NGOs, with stakeholders that know these target populations, because quite frankly, the real world is wonderful and you cannot make these things up. Thank you.
Thank you, Wouter. This is fascinating and a noble cause, so it's great work. Any questions from the audience? We have a little bit of time to take questions.
Hi. So one key question I have here is, you mentioned a little bit about the fact that one of the foundational elements in this is lack of identity documents, which puts a pretty significant burden on the registration eligibility process, right? When you start talking about tokens, and we see, I mean, I'm on the identity side of things, so I understand a little bit of what you're describing. How do you deal with scenarios of deduplication and account recovery?
That's a great question. Okay, you just hit the bonus part of my talk. What I just described to you today does not address this problem at all, right? It assumes that during the registration process, so nicely caught, there is some mechanism to figure out whether a household has already registered or not. And I don't think there is a great way to do this. And in particular, I actually believe that if your goal is to do registration on a household level, this is very, very difficult. There is, like, households are, unless you do sort of DNA analysis if you want, right, households are mostly a social concept, right? They're a social construct. And so it is very hard to see without external information whether Petros and I are actually related, or whether both of us can just show up and say, okay, I'm one household and Petros is another, and you really cannot distinguish these without using external information. And so this, I think, is in some sense really a fundamental limit of some of the things that we're trying to do. Now, you mentioned the magic word deduplication, which is a bit of a buzzword, I would say, in the humanitarian sector. And I would argue that as long as you do aid distribution on a household level, doing deduplication is amazingly difficult precisely because of the reasons that I just laid out. There's no ground truth somehow that you can somehow grab that you can build on top of. Now, what we've actually done in more recent work, which I'll actually be presenting at SMP in 2 weeks, is if you're willing to step away from the household setting, which I think is one can argue whether one should, right? Because that's typically not how these organizations operate. But okay, suppose you're willing to do that. Then you might argue, okay, then we could use biometrics to figure out these fingerprints I have already registered, at least on a conceptual level. And then of course the question becomes, okay, but now I have a new problem, right? Because now you just told me, okay, don't build this database of biometrics, right? Because this is very dangerous and we have seen a lot of harm come from that. And so how do you then solve that? And that is essentially what is in the SMP paper in 2 weeks. And I'm happy to share a link, right, where we again construct a careful system that lets us do precisely this one thing. Figure out this person that I have in front of me with this biometric sample, has this already been registered in this database or not? And nothing more than that. And that lets you sidestep a little bit this issue, but it's a hard thing to do. It's not an easy thing.
But let me follow up on that great question. And I know there's another question in the audience, so I'm keeping that in mind. But in practice, given that this system was deployed, right, Ish.
We can
Okay.
talk about that.
Yeah, we will talk about that. But in practice, what is kind of the imperfect solution to this right now? Is it like social, like vouching, like I am your neighbor and I kind of vouch for you being like in the same household as like Bert or whatever, not? Like, is this how you actually addressed it?
Yes. And so
Okay.
typically it's much more communal.
Communal, yeah.
Typically, if you think about a community of people, typically smaller communities, like the example that most often showed up in my conversations with the Red Cross was there is a village elder or a group of village elders that will sort of act as a trusted source of information, essentially just an oracle that you can query and it will tell you
The truth.
the truth, right? And of course this is, it's debatable, right? And we know that it doesn't always go well. Like registration is sometimes done by third parties. If you do registration by village elders, some of the maybe potential problems in this small community get potentially exacerbated, in the sense that maybe those people don't like me and therefore will in some sense act against me. And so these things are kind of hard to solve, right? And I don't want to in any way give the impression that I know how to do that, but I think it's important to be aware of that.
Great. I think there was a excuse me. I think there was another question in the audience. I saw somebody. Please.
You may allude to this in your talk, and if so, that's okay. Feel free to defer. But did you guys look at the cost and the technical ability and training that had to be done for the aid workers? I've worked in situations before where I've been providing aid, and the paper is really easy to say write on the paper and then mark off the paper, right? This other stuff, while it seems great, seems like it has a higher cost or burden to my team to get off the ground.
I will not debate this. I think this is valid. Taking a step back, right? I think your concern that whenever we introduce tech, we also make things difficult, absolutely valid, right? And I think part of what I'm trying to do is to figure out limits, like what we talked about earlier, right? If you do a household-based registration, you just cannot effectively do dedup. Not because we're stupid, just because the world is what it is, right? And knowing that will then let you have a much better discussion. And I would argue that also these notions of cost are what you would actually need to take into account when considering systems like this, maybe just as a pushback against donors to say, I'm sorry, but if I do all of this, and it works, right? And it's beautiful if you like cryptographic solutions, right? But the cost of deployment might actually be higher than doing the paper-based thing. And I think this one is actually relatively lightweight. And there have been experiments with smart card as tokens with a bit more centralized system, and that kind of worked, although fun stuff happened. So I think that is good, right? Like mostly that can be done. I think the solution that I sketched earlier, where you actually do the biometrics thing, I think the cost and the training would actually be much, much higher, and I'm really not sure if the trade-offs and the balance would work.
Understood. Thank you.
Please.
It's a very simple practical question, and it's a little bit outside of the technology and privacy concerns, things like that, which I think, is wonderful solutions. But in like a developing country, for example, in a smart card scenario, I've got to imagine most people are not accustomed to using things like that. So what provisions would there, when you bind aid provision to technology like this, like a smart card, for example, what provisions are there for lost, stolen, damaged smart cards in the process?
Very good question. So okay, let me sort of tease these apart. So the first is, what do you do with sort of your tech savviness or the lack of tech savviness among your target population? And I think this is a known problem. I think I would actually like to see much more research in this area to be done, because I think it's overlooked. It actually comes back in some sense to your question of cost, right? Like Like, do people even understand this? This notion of cards kind of works, I think, or at least in the experiments that I've seen, this sort of, kind of is okay. Then the other question, what do you do in terms of loss? What I actually didn't explain, and maybe some people have been looking at these numbers that I showed you and be like, okay, a few seconds, why is it actually so slow? One of the reasons that is slow is because the way we do sort of lost and stolen and whatever cards is we build a revocation mechanism that essentially lets us disable old cards and then reissue a new card. Now that's not perfect, but that was one of the things obviously that came out of our conversations of, okay, you built this system, right? You need to deal with this stuff because it happens. And so that is how we solve that.
All right. Well, I do encourage you to meet with Wouter at the end of the session and learn more about this great system. I will selfishly take the rest of the time to ask a few of my, although you covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. But let's take a seat for like 10 minutes or so, however long we have left, and go over a few of the things that I think like naturally come to mind, right, when you're looking at this system. First of all, great work and congrats on the award and for working on something so important. So we just spoke about lost cards, and my follow-up question to that is, did you have to provision means to update the card? Like, is there some sort of like software update, for lack of a better word, that needs to be deployed at some point? And like, how do you manage that in such a highly distributed system with resource constraints?
Unfortunately, you don't.
You
to some
don't.
degree.
Okay.
Which is a problem, right? And I think as a community, right, and clearly I'm a bit more from the academic side, and so I think some of the things that sometimes like we come up with might feel more simplistic, even though they use more advanced things, precisely because we don't take all of these things into account. On the other hand, it is also very difficult to provide the guarantees that we put in place while still being as flexible as you would want to be. So there is, I don't want to say there's always a trade-off, because I think that's actually a lie, and very often there is not, but sometimes there is, and I think this is one where at least we didn't find the right way around it yet, the right way to actually do updates. So the way we do, so updates in software, we essentially cannot do. Although you could also argue, right, like the system is simple enough that if you take a little bit of care building your software, probably you can get it right the first time, instead of, like, this is not something that is like 100,000 lines of code, right? And so I think that would help you. But there are also updates to what happens if your composition of your household changes, right? And so one needs to be, which is not necessarily software, but data.
But were you able to make assumptions about the distribution stations, at least, that those are relatively connected or relatively easier to update?
Yes, so that typically will work, although all of these are hard, right? It's like, and even like silly things like, can you import 50,000 smart cards into a country? Might turn out to be much more difficult than you would first think. And again, don't make this stuff up, but it's interesting.
No, but which kind of leads me to another question that I had. So you did go into detail about the smart cards, and from the questions in the audience, I think that smart cards could be a new technological element introduced to the lives of these people, right? When in fact smartphones might actually be there already in their hands, right? So is that the case, first of all, because that's just like my sort of intuition, and secondly, how did this system perform on the smartphones? Because you had some like TE sort of issues. So do you want to give us a little bit more color on the smartphone implementation?
Okay, let me again split this up.
Okay.
So I think the question of whether people have smartphones or not, or whether they have phones or not, really depends on the setting. where you deploy, right? For example, in Latin America, I think a lot of people would have phones or connectivity, and it's actually a big part of humanitarian aid in this context to deal with connectivity. In other areas, that is completely non-existent, or the phones that do exist are what we would call dumb phones instead of smartphones, which would not be very amendable to doing a lot of these things. So that is one thing, and this is also why in the end we wrote up both solutions, because it was really not clear which was the one to go. And obviously, if you have phones available, you would sort of prioritize that because that would work better, but it also assumes a certain level of tech savviness, right? That may or may not be present in this setting. So that's one thing. Then in terms of performance, the phone solution actually performs pretty well. Like, even though we're throwing much more heavy crypto at it, like the base crypto that you always need to do is like order of tens or hundreds of milliseconds, like easy, I would argue, compared to all the other stuff that you need to do. Like, these 100 milliseconds is fine. The only thing is a little bit more expensive is the revocation check, because whereas on a smart card, essentially you could just ask, here are all the cards that should now self-destruct, and they will do it, because that's what smart cards do. They do what they're programmed to do. Phones obviously will not, or at least you shouldn't trust them to. And so there is more, the tech required is a bit heavier, and that essentially ends up slowing things down a little.
Understandable. So here's like the hot burning question that I feel is in many people's minds. How did it all go? How did you deploy this? Did it work? Is it?
So, okay.
What's like, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot.
No, it's fine. Like, this is, I have to disappoint people here in the sense that if you think about what happened in the last, let's say, 2 years since we essentially finished this. I mean, we presented it last year, but I mean, it was done a little bit earlier. The geopolitical situation changed a little, which essentially means that a lot of humanitarian organizations have even less capacity right now than they had previously. And so it's still on the docket to do, right? But this is also, I think, is another lesson to learn, both from this project as well as other projects that I've done in other contexts. This takes time, and one needs to accept that the timelines for doing this type of work that is relatively cutting edge, even though the underlying tech might not be, right? But it's different than what you would normally do, takes time. And you gotta stick with it. And eventually, nice things will come out. But you cannot expect things to happen tomorrow, except if you're in a COVID pandemic.
And would you say that, from your experience, the primary limitation for this being stuck, for lack of a better word, right? Or being like delayed, would that be like the economics of the system, or would it be human resources and the lack of human resources because they have been redirected to other causes? Or like, what would you say, just going back to the question of the gentleman in the audience, like, would you say that it's sort of the economics or the human resources sort of, or something else?
I think both, because I would say these are somewhat similar.
Okay.
In the sense that, obviously, my lab, we're academics. So we can build prototypes, but we're not going to be deploying or doing customer support or doing any of these, right? And so there is sort of this gap between a proof of concept prototype and what you would roll out in practice. And somebody needs to pick this up. And humanitarian aid organizations typically don't have a dev team on standby. And commercial organizations have, but they might not be willing to donate these resources. And so I think that is a bigger problem that I cannot solve, right? I think it's a fair question, but in the end it just boils down to resources.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the gap between prototypes and production. Okay, so let's take a step in a slightly different direction. So this work solves a very interesting problem, but I'm also certain that this problem occurs also in other contexts, not just the humanitarian aid distribution. So have you given any thought in like applications of this line of work into other problems, like industrial problems maybe, or supply chain problems, which has been like a big issue in the last couple of years, more than 2 years. How long has it been since we started with COVID? And like I've lost track of time. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, have you considered applying this type of work in other contexts?
I have, but I'm also somewhat skeptical in the sense that what you see this type of work do is to thread the needle, as it were, of a very specific set of requirements. And it is not obvious that other problems would have the same set of requirements. So this is, I think, both bad news and good news. It is good news because it keeps me in a job. It is bad news in the sense that we're not yet there, I think, as a community to be very quick and very agile into quickly solving new problems as they appear. Like, we don't have, I think, a very good methodology for saying, okay, Petros says, okay, I have this new problem for you. Can you design a solution for this, or can you generate a solution for this? I don't think we are there yet, especially when privacy questions come into play. Now, for the supply chain things, it is, I think, one would need to play around with this, and maybe you're right, and maybe there are actually very interesting privacy questions there, and I think there might actually be, not on the human level that they were here, right, where we said, okay, we're dealing with vulnerable people that we want to protect, and that we don't want to mess over because they're using this tech that we're forcing upon them. But if you're thinking about supply chains, there might be commercial interests where you would still want to do some of this accounting without necessarily having to reveal a lot of details, and that could actually work. That's right.
So speaking of, and I think this is also naturally comes to mind. You're very privacy conscious here, which is great. But what was the threat model that you had in mind about privacy when you were doing this? Was it, like, my understanding is like one big privacy threat is bad actors trying to like reciprocate or like penalize people for working with the international agencies, right? Is that the main issue you're trying to solve for, or are there other implications in your privacy threat model?
I think this is the main concern, right? My main concern is, and also it's not just my concern, right? It's also from humanitarian organizations in general, is that they want to help people, and in the end they want to avoid that there are negative consequences for the people that they help. And these consequences happen, right? People have been denied or actually taken away citizenship because they received aid at some point in the past, which I think for any sort of like common sense reasoning, you would say that should not happen, right? And so there are these, so these consequences are, like you mentioned the word bad actors, like typically these are nation states doing these type of things, right? And especially in sort of these more fluid conflict situations, especially when it's not dealing with natural disasters, right? You just cannot necessarily predict how that will come about, and that puts very high burden, I would say, on just having very little data. And so the same thing, so that applies to transactional data, which is essentially what we're protecting here, as well as more sensitive things like biometrics, where really you want to avoid just having this database of biometrics, just because that essentially means that from now until forever, somebody that has that database can figure out, okay, was Wouter part of this aid program? Which again, right, like if you're denied citizenship or you had citizenship and somebody says, no, sorry, you're registered as a refugee at some point in your life, so therefore clearly you're not a citizen of this country, that can have very, very far-reaching consequences for people.
That's fascinating in a bad way, but well, we're looking forward to your upcoming presentation, because it looks like this work is not over yet, so that's very exciting. Thank you for being here. Let's thank the speaker again. And feel free to ask more questions outside the room. Unfortunately, we have to clear the room to prepare for the next talk, but Wouter will be around, and you can interact with him. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, everyone.